Megalopolis, Millennia by Brian Aldiss. Secret of a Mighty City. It is ironical that when men could finally have liberated themselves from dependence on the machine with the help of that phylosomatic tool, Galingua, they should have found themselves facing an overwhelming danger for which Galingua itself was responsible. By no means all of them faced this danger with the weary resignation of the prison warden. Give a man an enemy and you bring out both the best and the worst in him. With its hackles up, humanity went in to fight. Yet it is worth noting that even in this crisis, there were many people who took the long view and resigned themselves, not from indifference, but for finer reasons, to what they saw as their inevitable fate. These reasons were set forth cogently enough by Chisé Dutremy, writing some 500 years after Palmelia's time, when the quarter of Unisfar's population had faded into individually sentient cells and the whole complex structure of stellar intercourse was disintegrating. The dual theory that religion most generally accepted by enlightened men throughout the galaxy, Chisé wrote, claims that the universe was created by two similar but opposite forces, Tau and Plato. Tau created non-sentient matter. Plato, coming later, created sentient matter. The two forces are hostile to, or at best indifferent to, each other. Plato is by far the less powerful, for sentient matter must always depend to some extent upon non-sentient. The objectives of the two forces are as opposed as their natures. As far as man can comprehend Tau at all, his objectives may be described in the word endurance. He must endure through the matter he has created, perpetuating himself as it is perpetuated, and its perpetuation is only challenged by Plato. The sentient forces of Plato are infinitely weaker than his opponents. For one thing, the very nature of sentience is transient, for sentience entails development, which in its turn entails decay. Sentient objects, moreover, are easily overcome by non-sentient ones, floods, earthquakes, nova, and not only overcome but totally destroyed, and in that destruction converted into non-sentient objects. Plato has only one effective defense against the vast opposed ranks of nullity. The total material in the universe is finite and eventually exhaustible. The forces of Tau cannot therefore increase, but the forces of Plato can, for life and sentience are created out of the non-sentient, thus increasing themselves and decreasing the enemy. Man is one of Plato's finest instruments, for through him sentience is spread from planet to planet, banishing nullity. So said Chisé Dutremy in her exposition of the dual theory. Put briefly, it may be said that total feeling was the total good, while the total triumph of Tau would bring the evil of total non-feeling. Many men were quick to observe that the evolution of sentient cells was a further major step towards Tau's defeat. It represented an increase in feeling. For every small beacon called man, there could now be thousands on thousands of small lights launched against Tau's darkness. The dual theory was the first galactic religion. From its inception on the hub world of Wolf, it stood as cool and aloof from men as a tall mountain and as distant from their affairs as a Platonian hill. It recognized life and the finish of life. It recognized the chill of the night and the length of its ultimate duration. It recognized the shortness of day and its beauty. It knew that beyond all joy lay a curtain of something too cruel to be called sorrow, too unable to be called misery, that all flesh was air breathed and finished in a minute. but that in that minute, in that time for doing, lay all the truth that was. It was a galactic religion, hard to grasp and uncomforting when grasped, for which very reason the true adults of those days turned to it. It offered them no afterglow beyond the grave, nor did it speak of golden voices from other spheres. It bestowed no rewards for virtue or punishment for weakness. It had no altars. No one decked its shrines with flowers. No one set its tenets to a trumpeting music. Yet their hearts took on strength and depth from its sober truth. The believers were accordingly not afraid to demonstrate that the dual theory set little store by man and his glories. Man was an incidental in Plato's path to full sentience. The prime sentient unit was the cell. Now that it had learned to be itself by itself, it was forsaking that grouping called man, to which it had so long adhered, just as man had long since abandoned the tribe structure necessary to his primitive days. Therefore believers had no right to oppose a step which, according to their faith, furthered the aims of Plato, all of which, for many men, smacked of stupidity and their suicide. Whatever theories they held or did not hold, in practice they believed in the survival of man, and more particularly of themselves. The use of Galingua was prohibited. This meant the severing of those close bonds with which the planetary concourse had joined itself. Even the self-perpetuating war lost impetus, ceasing entirely to many regions, although the old solid system of space travel by spaceship was slowly reintroduced. The galaxy, even like man himself, began disintegrating into its individual members. War against the conqueror cell was on. Mainly it had to be a defensive battle. At the same time, religious strife broke out, non-believers fighting the theorists, who, as we have seen, were bound to oppose those they regarded as unwitting agents of Toh. Eventually the believers were massacred almost to a man. The legions which overcame them, driven by fear, gave no quarter. Clothed in fantastic antibiotic armors, which lent them some protection against vagabond cells, they filled their already threatened worlds with death. On Yunisvar, the strife was particularly bitter, dying down only when the menace of the cells itself became no longer a vital issue. Many ways of combating this menace were introduced, but the most effective was the aerostomas. The aerostomas represented a compromise between Toh and Plato. They were semi-sentient flying things made of pyrocasis-12, a malleable material susceptible to human thought impulses. Little more than airborne stomachs, the aerostomas flew low over land and sea and every planet threatened with cellular disintegration. On every planet threatened with cellular disintegration, swallowing the vagabond cells, compressing and stifling them. Of non-cellular origin, the aerostomas were immune to disintegration. A new princely order arose on Yunisvar, the triumphing men who went forth like knights to battle with the invisible foe, aerostomas perching on their shoulders or circling restlessly in the air above. Hard the triumphing men were, hard and brave. In the millennia that followed, they became a legend, and the legend was embodied in Thraldamina's exploits were many and his victories frequent, although there seems little doubt that his deeds have gained in the retelling. Whether humanity would ever have succeeded in vanquishing a foe which swelled its ranks from humanity is debatable. Its its ranks of humanity is debatable. A rapid form of cancer destroyed the cells. In their struggle for survival, they had overreached themselves. Virtually a new form of life, they were unstable, and their instability was their undoing. When diseased matter was first incorporated into their ranks, they had no way of combating it. The cancerous cells were a ravening enemy in their midst, maiming, destroying, obliterating. Man awoke one day to find himself again master of his world, with only a thin ash in the meadows to mark the end of one of nature's strangest experiments. This is no place to describe in detail the reconstruction of a federated galaxy, which man understood in a mood compounded at once of savagery and despair. It took more than 1,000,000 years, for something of his old thrust had gone. He had learned a new lesson, that he could be superseded from within, that even in his keenest hour of triumph, those cosmic chess players, Toe and Plato, regarded him simply as a seabed for future experiment. The Federation was patched. Its old easy confidence lay beyond mending. Unisphar, under the Galingua regime, for a far shorter period than most of its sister planets, had solid spaceships still in commission. With these, it was able to take a lead in galactic trade. The spirit of its people, hardened under the regime of the triumphing man, rendered it fit to compete with the most mercenary of rivals. Its banks swelled like overfed bellies. Its merchants walked in golden slippers. The city of Nunian sprawled and lost its shape like a gorged python. Mammon was back on his throne, and the following fragment reflects only a tiny portion of his face. The mighty creature was reeling. The hunter's last shot had caught it right between its eyes. Now, all 50 graceless tons of it, the beast reared up high above the treetops, trumpeting in agony. For a moment the sun, beautiful and baleful, caught it poised like an immense swan before it fell, silent now, no more protesting, headlong into the undergrowth. And there lies another triumph for man, the unconquerable, proclaimed the commentator. On this planet, as on others, all life finally bows before a man from Unisphar. Yes, every one of these monsters will be slaughtered by this time. By this time, someone had warned the projectionist of a new arrival now waiting to use a little editing theatre, and the projectionist, in a panic, cut everything. The 3D image vanished. The sound slicked out. Lights came on, revealing Big Cello of supernova solids standing by the entrance. Hope we didn't disturb you, Big Cello said, watching everyone hustling up to leave. Not at all, Cello 69, a subdirector replied. We'll solidify this one tomorrow. I wouldn't like to think we'd interrupted, Big Cello said bluntly. But Rhapsody 182 here has something he seems to want to show us. And he nodded, not without easy menace, at the lean figure of Harsh Bendel, known to the inmates of Supernova as Rhapsody 182. 2 minutes later, the last minions had fled from the theatre, leaving the intruding party in occupation. Well, Rhapsody, let's see what you have to show us, Big Cello observed heavily, settling his bulk in one of the armchair seats. Sure thing, BC, Harsh Brendan said. He was one of the few men on the Supernova allowed to call the chiefs by initials, rather than by the full united name. He jumped now with the parody of athleticism onto the now stage in front of the solid screen and smiled down at his audience. It consisted of some 25 people, half of whom Rhapsody knew only by sight. The company broke down roughly into 4 groups: the chief and his augmen, Rhapsody's own augmen, headed by Omeo 3, a handful from story and market response, and their augmen, plus the usual quota of attractive stylus recorders. The idea is embedded in a solid, Rhapsody began, that's going to give Supernova a terrific boost, because it's going to have 1 studios as background. It's going to have our studios as background, and some of our personnel as players. At the same time, it's going to pack a colossal punch in terms of human drama and audience appeal. Not only that, its backdrop is Lumion, the greatest planetary capital in the galaxy. Rhapsody paused for effect. Several members of his audience were lighting up afro hails. All were quiet. I can see you're asking yourselves, Rhapsody said, essaying a smile, just how I intend to cram so much more into 1 2-hour solid. I'll show you. He raised a hand eloquently as a signal to his projectionist. A solid appeared on the screen. It was the face of a man in his late 40s. The years had dried away the flesh and only succeeded in revealing, under the fine skin, the nobility of bone structure, the tall forehead, the set of cheekbone, the justness of the jaw. He was talking, although the sound was off, leaving the animation of the features to speak for themselves. The countenance completely dwarfed Rhapsody 182. This, ladies and gentlemen, Rhapsody said, clenching his fist and holding them out before him, is the face of Aldiss Staker. The audience began sitting up, looking at one another, engaging the climate of opinion. Rhapsody had deliberately called Stacker by his true rather than his united name. It was customary in big combines like Supernova to use people's district plus block number as names. Not only did this serve to present a united front to confuse outsiders, it helped insiders to place you financially. For districts in Union were islands divided according to grandeur. You had to be a credit king to live on Cello, whereas on Pelt and Chickle, no one but deadbeats were permitted to live. As Stakia had been an individualist, somehow his united name of Bastion 44 had never fitted, as Rhapsody now emphasized. Gratified at the audience's response, he continued, the face of a great man as Stacker, a genius known only to a now circle of men here in this very studio where he worked, yet all who knew him admired, and why don't I say it, loved him. I had the honour to be his right-hand man back in the days when he was boss of Documentary 2. I planned this solid to be his biography, a tribute to Aldiss Staker. Bastion 44. He paused. If he could swing this one on Big Cello and Company, he was made. Because it boosted Aldiss Staker, it was also going to boost Harsh Bending until that erstwhile Rhapsody ended up mellow on the cello levels. Staker ended up in the gutter, someone called out. That was Starfield 1337, a troublemaker. I am glad someone raised that point, Rhapsody continued, carefully snubbing Starfield by omitting his name. Staker finished up in the gutter. He couldn't make the grade. This solid is going to show why. It's going to show just how much grit is needed simply to stay sane in a union. It's going to show how much grit is needed to serve the public as we serve them, because, like I said, it's going to be a solid, not just about our Stacker, but about Supernova, and about Union, and about life. In short, it's going to have everything. The gentle face faded from the screen, leaving the small figure of Rhapsody standing on the platform alone. Although thin to the point of emaciation, Rhapsody perpetually consumed slimming tablets for the luxury of hearing his underlings refer to him as gangling, which he held to be a term of affection. And the beauty of this solid is, he continued dramatically, the beauty is that it's already half made, written, directed, solidified. Images began to grow in the seemingly limitless depths of the cube. Something as intricate and lovely as the magnification of a snowflake stirred and seemed to drift towards the audience. It enlarged, sprouting detail, elaborating itself until every tiny branch had other branches. It seemed, thanks to a clever camera work, to be an organic growth. Then the descending, slowing, a viewpoint at length revealed it to be a creation of concrete and imperv and ferroline, moulded by man into buildings and thoroughfares, into levels and mazes, stabbing into the air or burrowing into the earth. This, Rhapsody pronounced, is the fabulous city, our fabulous city, the city of Nunion. Nunion, gelled by Unit 2 under Stacker at the height of his powers, 20 years ago. This solid was to be his greatest work. It was never completed for a reason I will tell you later. But the 16 reels of unedited Cassius gel he left behind as his greatest memorial have lain in our vaults all that time. I dug them out the other day. Now I'm going to talk for a while. I'm going to ask you to sit back and appreciate the sheer beauty of these shots. I'm going to ask you to try and judge their value in terms of aesthetic reaction and viewer's appeal. I'm going to ask you to relax and watch a masterpiece in which I'm proud to say I had something of a hand. The image continued to sink gradually below the highest towers, through the aerial levels, the pedestrian, human and ahuman esplanades, the various transport and service strata, down to the ground, the imperv pavement, at which point a convex glass traffic guide reflected in miniature the whole of that long camera descent from the skies. Then the focus shifted laterally, taking in the vermilion boots of a flux officer. Almost unnoticed, the commentary had begun. It was typical Unit 2 commentary, quiet, unemphatic, spoken in R. Stacker's own voice. On the 70,000 planets which occupy the single galaxies inhabited by man, there is no more vast or diverse a city than Nunion, the commentary said. It has become a fable to all men of all races. To describe it is impossible without descending into statistics and figures, and this is to lose sight of the reality. We ask you to explore some of the reality with us. Forget the facts and figures. Look instead at the fluxways and mansions, and above all, at the individuals which comprise Nunion. Look and ask yourself, how does one find the heart of a great city? What secret lies at the core of it when one arrives there? Nunion had grown over the 10 islands of an archipelago in the temperate zone of Unisphar, spreading from the nearby continent. 500 bridges, 150 subfluxes, 60 heliplane routes and innumerable ferries, gondolas and sailing craft interconnected the 11 sectors and 45 districts. Lining the water lanes, or breaking the seemingly endless phalanxes of streets with avenues of either natural or polychaetic trees, with here and there, perhaps at some focal point in the Israel Memorial, the rare and lovely Jenny Merritt, newly imported, perpetually flowering. The camera swept over Clive Amethyst Bridge now, hovering before the first block beyond the waterway. A young man was coming out of the block, springing down the outer steps, 3 at a time. On his face were mingled excitement, triumph and joy. He could hardly contain himself. Buoyed with exultation, he could not walk fast enough. He was a young man in any large city, the man about to make his mark, to score his first success. Confident beyond sense, exuberant beyond measure. In him, one could see the drive that had reached out to 70,000 planets and dreamed of 70,000 more. The commentator did not say this. The picture said it for him, catching the young man's strut, his angular shadow sharp and restless on the pavement. Sharp and restless too, the scene changed, singular shadows becoming angular shapes. Down billions of miles of pipe that were Nunion's veins and drains swam the changing ghost shapes of pseudoleucocytes. With eerie mobility, they preyed on the sewage of the Megalopolis, ingesting it, cleaning it, sealed away from human sight. The half-live phantoms went about their needs, which also served the cities. Others of the capital servitors paraded through the illusory emptiness of the cube, the a-human menials whose immunity to hard radiation had earned them the task of tending the universal air conditioning, the electronic brains out at Starfield, the human brain culture under Peach Bosphorus that handled a guaranteed 2 million decisions every day, the undead of the communications exchanges, where pep nerves routed with mindless precision the messages of every district. The pictures were brilliant, at once clear but non-literal. No commentary was used, for none was needed. But Rhapsody 182 could not stay silent. He came forward so that his figure bit its silhouette out of the solid. That's the way it was with Stackier, he said, always digging for what he called the exact revealing detail. Maybe that's why he got no further than he did. He drove us crazy for the sake of that detail. These are just shots of a big city, a man from a story called up impatiently. We've seen this sort of cubage before. Just what does it all add up to? Use your eyes, see the pattern forming, Harsh replied. That was how it was when Stacker was concerned. He let the thing evolve, without imposing a pattern. Watch this coming shot now, for gentle comedy. Young lovers had come sweeping up a bastion water lane in a powered float. They moored, stepped ashore, and walked arm in arm across a mosaic walk to the nearest cafe. They chatted animatedly as they found a table. Background music changed tempo. The focus of attention slid from the lovers to the waiters. Their smoothness of manner while serving was contrasted with their indifference when they were behind scenes, in the squalor and confusion of the kitchen. A waiter was followed off duty down to subterranean Pelt, where he submerged himself in a 2-credit tub of Diraco and slipped. Get the idea, Rhapsody asked his audience. Our Stacker is digging. He's peeling off stratum after stratum of the mightiest city of all time. Before we're through, you're going to see just what he found at the bottom. Hardly for a moment had he taken his eyes off Big Cello, whose deadpan countenance was partially hidden by wreaths of afro hair. The chief now crossed his legs. That could be had a sign perhaps of impatience. Rhapsody, who had learned to be sensitive about such things, thought it time to try a direct sounding. Coming to the edge of the stage, he leaned forward and said ingratiatingly, "Can you see it building, BC?" "I'm still here," Big Cello answered. It could be called a relatively enthusiastic response. Those of you who never had the privilege of meeting ours, Rhapsody continued, will be asking what sort of man could reveal a city with such genius. Not to keep you in suspense any longer, I'll tell you. When I was on this last assignment, I was just a youngster in the solid business. I learned a lot from him in the matter of plain everyday humanity as well as in technique. We're going to show you a bit of film now that a cameraman of Unit 2 took of ours without his knowing. I believe you'll find it sort of moving. The solid was suddenly there, seeming to fill all the audience's vision. In a corner of one of Union's many starports, Oz Stacker and several of his documentary team sat against junked oxygenation equipment, taking lunch. Oz was 68 and passing his middle years. Hair blown over his eyes, he could be seen devouring a gigantic kifef sandwich and talking to a youth with a space cut. Looking out at the solid, Rhapsody identified the younger self with some embarrassment and said, "You have to remember this was taking all of 20 years back. You weren't so gangling in those days," one of the audience called. Our Stacker was speaking. Channel 69 had given us the chance to go through with this, he was saying, so let's see we use the chance properly. Anyone in a city this size can pick up interesting faces or build up architectural angles into a pattern with the help of a background noise. Let's try for something deeper. What I want to find is what really lies at the heart of the greatest metropolis ever known to man. Supposing there is no heart, Stacker, the youthful Rhapsody asked. He had been only a tiger dweller in those days. I mean, you hear of heartless men and women. Couldn't this simply be a heartless city? A semantic quibble, our Stacker replied. All men and women have hearts, even the cruel ones. Same with cities. I'm not denying Nunyon isn't a cruel city in many ways. People who live in it have to fight continually. The good in them gradually gets overlaid and lost. You start good, you end bad just because you... Oh, hell. You forget, I suppose. You forget you're human. Our Stacker paused and looked searchingly at the blank young face before him. Never mind watching out for Nunyon, he said, almost curtly. Watch out for yourself. He stood up, wiping his big hands on his slacks. One of his compo crew offered him an asphail and said, well, that's it on the starport angle. Stacker, we've gelled all we need to here. What sector do we head for next? Our Stacker looked around smilingly. The set of his jaw noticeable. We take on the politicians next, he said. The youthful Rhapsody scrambled to his feet, his manner noticeably more aggressive. Say if we could clear up the illegal rackets of Nunyon, he said. Why, we'd get our solids and the doing everyone a favour too. We'd be doing everyone a favour too. We'd be famous, all of us. I was just a crazy, idealistic kid back in those days, the mature Rhapsody at once abashed and delighted protested to the audience. I still to learn that life is nothing but a kind of coordination of rackets. He smiled wildly to indicate that he might be kidding. Saw that Big Cello was not smiling and lapsed into silence. In the cube, Unit 2 was picking up his traps. The cumbersome polyhedron of a transburst freighter from far Lapaka sank into the landing pits behind them and blew piercingly. I'll tell you the sort of thing we want to try and capture, our Stacker told his team as he shouldered a pack of equipment. When I first came to this city to join Supernova, I was standing in the lobby of the Justice Building before an important industrial case was being tried. A group of local politicians about to give evidence passed me, and I heard one say, as they went in, I've never forgotten it, have your hatreds ready, gentlemen. For me, it will always symbolize the way that prejudice can engulf a man. Touches like that we must have. Our Stacker and Unit 2 trudged out of the picture. Shabby, determined. The solid faded, and there before the screen stood Rhapsody 182, spruced, determined. It still doesn't begin to stack up, Rap, a voice spoke up. It was Rhapsody 77, a rival of Rhapsodies and Big Cellos. Personal manager. You had to be careful with a man like that. Perhaps you missed the subtleties, Rhapsody suggested instantly. The thing's stacking fine. That little cameo has just demonstrated to you why ours never made the grade. He talked too much. He shot off his mouth to kids like I was then. He wasn't hard, he was nothing more or less than just an artist, right? If you say so, Rap, the answer came levelly. but Double Seven turned at once to say something inaudible to Big Cello. Rhapsody made a brusque signal to the projection box. He would swing this deal on Supernova if he had to stay here all afternoon and evening to do it. Behind him, our stacker, Union was created once more, a city which administered the might of Unisfar's growing dominance and magnetized the wealth of a galaxy assembled as the mind of our stacker had visualized it 2 decades before. Evening was falling over its maze of furline canyons. The sun set. Great globes of atomic light, tethered in the sky, poured their radiance over thoroughfares, moving with a new awareness. The original commentary dimmed, giving Rhapsody the opportunity to provide his own. Night, he said briskly. Ours caught it all as it's never been caught before or since. He used to tell me I remember that night was the time a city showed its claws. We spent 2 weeks looking for sharp broken shadows. The craze for significant detail began. The clawed shadows moved in, fangs of light etched against the dark flanks of side alleys, an almost tangible restlessness, like the noisy silence of a jungle, moved across the ramps and squares of Nunnian. Even the present onlookers could feel it. They all sat more alertly in their seats. Behind a facade of civilization, the nightlife of Nunnian had a primitive ferocity. The Jurassic wore evening dress. In our stacker's interpenetration, it was essentially a dreary world, the amalgam of the homesicknesses and lusts of the many thousand nations that had drifted to Unisfar. The individual was lost in an atom-lit wilderness, where 90 million people could be alone together within a few square farlings. It was quite clear that the thronging multitudes, waiting in line for leg shows and jerky joints, were harmless. Living in flocks, they had developed the flock mentality. They were too harmless to tear anything of value out of the matter of union. All they seemed to ask for was a good time. Into the cube came the hard steppers, the ones who could afford to buy solitude and a woman or pneuma dancer to go with it. They drifted above the sparkling avenues in bubbles, they ate in undersea restaurants, nodding in brotherly fashion to sharks swimming beyond glass walls. They whined in 100 dives, they sat absorbed over games of chance, always at the imperious signal of an eye there was someone to come running, a man who sweated and trembled as he ran. In short, a galactic city. Power must remember it is powerful. The scene changed, the view swept over the old Jandaga and began to investigate Bosphorus Concourse. The concourse lay at the heart of Nunnian. Here the search for pleasure reached its peak. Barkers cried rival attractions, polyhermophores signalled, liquor flowed in never-ending stream, cinema vied with participation hall, quips and quaints beckoned from drifting floats. Women of the night moved sleek and busy, 1,000 sensations. The perversions of a galaxy were available at a price. Man, conscious as never before of all his cells, had invented a different thrill for each. Rhapsody 182 could not resist adding a word. Have you ever seen such realism? He demanded. Ordinary folks like you, like me, getting down to having themselves a time. Think what promotion these shots are for. Nunnian, and where they've been these last 20 years. Why, down in our vaults, neglected, almost lost. Nobody would ever have seen them if I hadn't hunted them up. Big Cello spoke. I've seen them, Rhapsody, he said throatily. They're just too sordid to have popular appeal. Rhapsody stood absolutely still. A dark stain rose in his face. Those few words told him, and everyone else present, exactly where he stood. If he persisted, he would rouse the chief's anger. If he backed down, he would lose face. In the stolid behind Rhapsody, men and women jostled for admission to an all-sense horror show. Death in Death Cell 6. Above them, gigantic, was a quasi-live gel of a man being choked, head down, eyes popping, mouth agape. "We needn't show all this sort of stuff, of course," Rhapsody said, grinning as if in pain. "I'm just giving it a run-over to put the general idea before you. We'll settle on the final details later, naturally." Naturally. Big Cello nodded. "You're too hot on Bastion 44, though, Rap," he said kindly. "He was only a bum with the camera after all." Our Stacker's city was emptying now. Crumpled Afro-Hail packets, mini newscasts, tickets, program, Proventos, 6 sticks, handbills and flowers lay in the gutter. The revellers were straggling home to sleep. A fog settled lightly over Bosphorus Concourse, emphasizing the growing vacancy of the place. A fat man, clothed, unbuttoned, reeled out of a participation hall and made for the nearest moveway. It spun him off like a leaf in a drain. 3 1/2 sounded from plateau to court. Lights snapped off in a deserted restaurant, leaving on the retina an after-image of upturned chairs. Even the cello pleasure domes went dim. One last drab clattered wearily home, clutching her handbag tightly. Yet the concourse was not empty of humanity. The remorseless eye of the camera hunted down in sundry doorways the last watchers of the scene, the ones who had stood motionless, not participating, when the evening was at its height. Watching the crowd, they waited in doorways as if peering for warrants. From the shadows their faces gleamed with a terrible, inexpressible tension. Only their eyes moved. "These men," Rhapsody said, really fascinated our Stacker. They were his discovery. He believes that if anyone could lead him to the heart of the city, these people could. These subterraneans in doorways. Night after night they were there. Stacker called them the impotent spectres of the feast. The solid screen blanked, then filled with form once again. An overhead camera tracked 2 men down a canal sidewalk. Our Stacker and his young assistant, Rhapsody 182, they had moved away down to the quiet side of Tiger. The 2 figures paused outside a shabby boutique, looking doubtfully at the sign. "A Willet's Costumes Investments. I have the feeling we're going to turn up something," Ars was saying as the sound came on. "We're going to hear what a city really is from someone who must have felt its atmosphere most keenly. With this fellow, we're digging right down into the heart of it. But it won't be pleasant." Darkness. It seemed to seep out of the black G-suits. They were the antique tailor's speciality, hanging stiff and bulkily around the walls, funereal in the gloom. The costumier, Willets, was a newt of a man. His features were recognizable as those of one of Concourse night watchers, now trailed to his lair. Willet's eyes bulged and glistened like those of a drowning rat. He denied ever going to Bosphorus Concourse. When ours persisted, he fell silent, dangling his little fingers against the counter. "I'm not a flux officer," our Stacker said. "I'm simply curious. I want to know why you stand there every night the way you do." "It's nothing to be ashamed of," Willets muttered, dropping his eyes. "I don't do anything." "That's just it. You don't do anything. Why do you and others like you stand there, not doing anything? What are you thinking of? What do you see? What do you feel? I've got business to attend to, Willits protested. I'm busy. Can you see I'm busy? I want to know what you feel. How you tick, Willits. Leave me alone, will you? Answer my question and I'll go away. We could make it worth your while, Willits, young Rhapsody added, with a knowing look. The little man's eyes were furtive. He licked his lips. He seemed so tired, his tiny frame devoid of blood. Leave me alone, he said. That's all I ask. Leave me alone. I'm not hurting you, am I? A customer might come in any time. I'm not answering your questions. Now please get out of here. Unexpectedly, our stacker jumped, pinning the little man backward across the counter. Of the two, Stacker's face was the more desperate. Willits, he said, I've got to know. I've been digging into the cesspit of a city week after week, and you're the thing I found at the bottom of it. You're going to tell me what it feels like down there, or, so help me, I'll break your neck. How can I tell you, Willits demanded, with sudden mouse-like fury. I can't tell you. I haven't got the words. You'd have to be one of my kind before you'd understand. In the end, they gave it up and left Willits panting, lying behind his counter in the dust. I didn't mean to lose control, our stacker said, pressing his brow, licking his knuckles as he emerged from the shop. He must have known the camera was on him, but was too preoccupied to care. Something just went blank inside me. We've all got our hatreds far too ready. I guess I must find out. His set face loomed larger and larger in the cube, eclipsing all else. One eyelid was flickering uncontrollably. He moved out of sight. Everyone was talking in the audience now, except the chief. They had all enjoyed the beating up. Seriously, Formula 3 was saying. Atlassian had something. You'd really solidify, of course, with proper actors. Have a few broken teeth. Maybe finish with the little guy getting knocked into the canal. Timing his exits was a specialty with Rhapsody. He had them awake, and now he'd show them no more. He came slowly down the few steps into the auditorium. So there's the story of a man called R. Stacker, he said, as his right foot left the last step. He couldn't take it. After he beat up that little tailor, he dropped everything and disappeared into the stews of Union. He didn't even stay to round off his picture, and Unit 2 folded then and there. He was a quitter. How come we've had to wait 20 years to hear all this? Came a shout from Rhapsody 77. Carefully, Rhapsody 182 spread his hands wide and smiled. Because our stacker was a dirty word when he first quit, he said, aiming his voice at Big Cello, and after that he was forgotten. Then, well, it happened I ran into Stackers a couple of days back, and that gave me the idea of working over the old Unit 2 files. He tried to move in front of Big Cello to make it easier for the chief to compliment him on his sagacity if he felt so inclined. You mean Art is still alive? 77 persisted. He must be quite an old man now. What's he doing, for Tao's sake? He's a down-and-out bum, Rhapsody said. I didn't care to be seen talking to him, so I got away from him as soon as possible. He now stood before the chief. Well, BC, he said, as calmly as he could. Don't tell me you don't smell a solid there. Something to sweep them off their feet and knock them into the aisles. As if deliberately prolonging the suspense, Big Cello took another drag on his afro-hail, then removed it gently from his mouth. We have to have a pair of young lovers in it, Big Cello said. Sure, Rhapsody exclaimed, scowling to hide his elation. Young lovers, there's an idea, a great idea. I see it as a saga of the common man, Hurricane 304 suggested. We could call it Our Fear City, if that title isn't legally sequestered. It's a vehicle for Erdru Expulso, someone else suggested. They were playing with it. Harsh had won the day. He was hustling out of the little theatre when a hand touched his arm and Rhapsody 777 pulled him back. "How did you happen to find our stacker again?" he asked. "Well," Rhapsody said happily, "I happened to have a rendezvous a couple of nights back. I was looking for a heli-bubble afterwards when I happened to walk through Bosphorus concourse. The old wreck hanging about in a doorway recognized me and called out. It was ours. I kept on going, of course, but it put me on to the concept of this solid. Didn't you ask ours if he'd found out what was at the heart of the city? That was what he'd gone looking for, wasn't it? What's it matter? That quaint had nothing we'd want to buy. His clothes were in rags. I tell you why. The crazy fool was shivering with Viro. I was lucky that Bubble came when it did." They made The Solid, one of Supernova's big budget productions for the year. It took in credits on every inhabited planet of the Federation, and Rhapsody 182 was a powerful, respected man thereafter. They called it Song of a Mighty City. It had 3 electronic orchestras, 17 hit tunes, and a regiment of Numa dancing girls. The solidization was gelled in the studio using the pastel shades deemed most appropriate, and they finally selected a more suitable city than Union for backgrounds. Our stacker, of course, did not come into it at all.